Next, we have a very special treat for you. Our next speaker is dialing in all the way from New Zealand. Mr. Greg Harford is the Chief Executive of Retail NZ, a non-profit incorporated society representing the interests of New Zealand's retailers. In this exclusive session, Greg will share with us an overview of the trends in New Zealand and the retail economy, as well as retailing in New Zealand through the highs and the lows of COVID-19. We hope you would enjoy this presentation and it would give you a different perspective of retailing in another market. And maybe you can adapt some of it here. Ladies and gentlemen, coming up next, Mr. Greg Harford. Stay tuned.
Selamat pagi, Malaysia, or as we say here in New Zealand, kia ora koutou. I'm really pleased to be here this morning talking to you about retailing in New Zealand through the lows and highs of COVID-19. It's been a really challenging 12 months for everyone in the New Zealand retail market, as it has been for everyone in Malaysia and indeed globally. So this morning I was just going to talk through a few points. I was going to give you some context about the New Zealand retail market. Talk about the impacts of COVID-19 and what that's done to retail spending here in New Zealand. I'm going to give you a little bit of detail about some of the lockdown regulations that have applied in New Zealand and what that's meant for retailers, and talk about how retailers here have really been trying to work hard to overcome COVID-19 through innovation, through e-commerce, and lots of hard work. Talk a little bit about key challenges in the New Zealand retail market and the outlook for the future. So first I thought I should just give you some quick information about New Zealand, because some of you may well ask, where is it? Well, we're that small group of islands to the east of Australia. We're about 3,000 kilometres from Sydney, and we're about 11 hours flying time southeast of Kuala Lumpur. Geographically, our islands make up about 268,000 square kilometres, and our population is really small. We're just 5 million people, but we make up for that with, of course, our 26 million sheep. In comparison, Malaysia, of course, as you know, is a lot bigger. You're 329,000 square kilometres, but you have many more people than we do. You've got 33 million people up there in Malaysia, but of course, not a lot of sheep, only 138,000 of them. So I guess just to give you a bit of context of the New Zealand market, we're relatively small. We're a long way from the rest of the world, but of course we do have what has been a thriving retail market here. I thought it would be useful just to give you an overview of what retailing in New Zealand looked like before COVID-19 hit us. Across the sector, we turned over about $98 billion worth of sales. That's New Zealand dollars, which is equivalent roughly to 282 billion Malaysian ringgit. So again, relatively small in global terms, but nonetheless a thriving market. Here in New Zealand, there are about 27,000 retail businesses that operate from about 35,000 sites. So again, quite a large number of actual businesses, but many of them are very small. Our total sales growth in the 5-year period from 2013 to 2018 was just 4.7%. So that's been relatively positive for the sector, but of course it's nothing like what you've seen in Malaysia. It's less than half the growth that you would have seen there over an equivalent period. One of the really interesting things about New Zealand is that although e-commerce is here and has been here for a long time, only a relatively small number of sales have actually been online. Just under 9% of all sales pre-COVID were done over the internet. Just to let you know too a little bit more about the New Zealand retail market, about 10% of all jobs in this country are in the retail sector. But half of retail businesses are owner-operators who employ nobody. That's right, they have no staff. It's just perhaps a husband and wife team or a family business. And there are just 345 retail businesses that employ more than 100 people. So what we've got is a very large number of very small retail businesses and a very small number of large businesses, which tend to dominate much of the retail activity. Average net profit margins in retail, as you know, are relatively low. Here in New Zealand, across the sector, pre-COVID, they were sitting there at about 3.9%. There's a little bit of variation in there. Some parts of the sector have a greater net profit margin than others, but on average, it's sitting there at 3.9%. So what did COVID-19 mean for New Zealand retailers? Well, it all started, of course, early last year in 2020. Around January, we started detecting that there was a bit of an economic slowdown going on. The market was definitely not booming away as it had been in the latter half of 2019. International visitors to New Zealand were starting to dry up. We were seeing fewer tourists and fewer visitors coming to New Zealand, and that was starting to impact retail sales. It also led to a bit of a confidence crisis. There were many New Zealand customers who were starting to think, oh, what's going on in China? What's happening with COVID-19 internationally? And people were just not getting out and shopping as much as we would have liked them to. So January was a bit gloomy from a retail sector point of view, but in February and March, we got into some pretty difficult situations. Overseas media drove panic buying through that period. In Australia, as you probably saw, there were almost riots over the sale of toilet paper in supermarkets. Here in New Zealand, we didn't have the physical violence that we saw over there, but we did have huge demand for basic products. Now, there was no need for that. All the products that New Zealanders needed to be able to buy over the coming months were always here and always available. But the media concern that was put there in the market really made consumers question, whether those products were going to be there. And they went out and they bought up large. There was a significant increase in grocery sales through that late February period in particular, and then into March. And the big issue from that was that it really stretched supply chains. Obviously, supermarkets and businesses are used to dealing with a certain amount of product. When you saw that volume or the demand from customers double or triple almost overnight, it was very hard for the logistics side of businesses to keep up with that. So it really did stretch supply chains. It did lead to some products not being on shelf, but that was because they were en route from distribution centres. New Zealand, like many other countries, adopted a system of lockdowns to COVID-19. There was a 4-stage alert system introduced by the government in March. Excuse me. That 4-stage alert system goes from level 1, which is we've got to be really pretty careful, but everyone can carry on and do their business pretty much as usual, through to level 4, which was a very extreme lockdown. We went, much to many people's surprise, including my own, the New Zealand government decided to impose a level 4 lockdown pretty early on in the piece. From the 25th of March to the 27th of April, we were in a total lockdown here in New Zealand, and then a limited lockdown at level 3 continued through until the 13th of May. This was truly unprecedented for New Zealand. We've never had a situation where everyone in New Zealand has been told pretty much to stay at home. Unlike some of the lockdowns that we've seen in other markets, particularly in Europe, the lockdown here at level 4 was really very stringent. The instruction was very clear. Stay home, do not leave your home unless you are an essential worker or you are going to the supermarket. In many other countries, it's been permitted for you to leave your house to go to work. That wasn't the case here in New Zealand. So our 5 million people and our 26 million sheep were suddenly locked up for a period of about 6 weeks. The only shops that were allowed to open at level 4 were those that the government considered essential. That was to say pretty much supermarkets. The view from government, perhaps not really having thought it through in as much detail as we would have liked, was that you can buy everything you need to live at supermarkets. And then as we went through those first few weeks, there were a few changes made. Pet shops, for example, were allowed to open to sell food. Doctors were allowed to be prescribing goods, and pharmacies were allowed to open and so forth. But for the most part, it was really purely supermarkets. Supermarkets were the main source of retailing through that period, and indeed the only source of social interaction for many New Zealanders. We're quite a sociable people. We're often getting out and about. And I think it was very hard for many people to be locked at home under government orders for so many weeks. As I say, on the 27th of April, about a month after that really strict lockdown started, we moved to a level 3 lockdown. That was much more limited. Some businesses were allowed to open, but the instruction was that you still had to stay home if you could and work from home. While some businesses were allowed to open, retailers were not. Retail stores have to keep their doors closed at level 3, although e-commerce was permitted for the first time. And I should actually just mention here that while we were at level 4 in the first of the most severe lockdowns, e-commerce was not permitted either. So despite the fact that the risk of transmitting COVID-19 was pretty small, you'd have to say through some sort of e-commerce platform, it wasn't allowed for New Zealanders to shop online, or indeed for New Zealand businesses to fulfil orders from customers. The only exception, again, were supermarkets and pharmacies. New Zealand's lockdown journey ended in the middle of May last year. There were no cases of COVID-19 here in New Zealand. That was really good news. We came out of the level 3 lockdown, moved into level 2, which was quite cautious, but most businesses were allowed to reopen then. And all seemed to be going fairly well. But we have subsequently had 3 more limited level 3 lockdowns in Auckland, our largest city. Those lockdowns happened in August of last year, and then February of this year, and again towards the end of February and into March of 2021. Those lockdowns for the retail sector were enormously disruptive because, of course, it meant that the retail businesses needed to close their doors. They weren't allowed to have customers come in the store. And the only way that retailers are able to serve customers during level 3 is to offer an online service or a click and collect service or even a phone order service. And the challenge with it, I think, has been that these lockdowns have been implemented very quickly by government, typically. There's not been a lot of notice, and everyone in the retail industry has had to be scrambling very much to try and implement government decisions. There's quite a lot involved in closing down a retail business when that instruction comes almost overnight or same day. And it's been very challenging for many businesses to get their head around. Now, you may well ask, well, what has been the outcomes of all these lockdowns on the retail sector? Well, of course, as you'd expect, when we were at level 4, retail sales absolutely collapsed. We saw about an 80% fall in retail sales over that period. At the same time, of course, retailers had fixed costs that they needed to continue meeting. There was rent to be paid, there were staff to be paid, there were suppliers and support organisations that needed to be paid. The response of many was to be thinking about reducing the number of employees, to be making people redundant, or to be reducing the hours that they were paying people for. The New Zealand government came to the party pretty quickly with a support package. It was called the wage subsidy, and it came into effect actually even before the lockdown itself. And that provided a good amount of cash to help businesses pay their people through this very difficult time. So that meant that actually we didn't see the job losses that we might have expected. Certainly early on in the lockdown, I was predicting that we might have seen 10 or 20,000 job losses through the sector. That hasn't eventuated, and in large part it's because of the wage subsidy that the government put in place and the support that it offered to New Zealand retailers. One of the real problems with the level 4 lockdown, though, was that the rules were really strict, as I say. The rules banned online trading as well as the distribution of logistics goods, even for businesses where people worked at home. If you're a small e-commerce retailer, for example, and you operate out of your garage or your spare bedroom, you weren't able legally to service your customers, sell your goods, or get your product out the door. That's really damaging for a retailer. There was significant demand for goods from consumers, and it was increasingly difficult, I think, for the government to maintain its social license as we went through this period. As I say, there was a lot of pressure on government, and we did see a loosening of the classification of essential goods as we went through those difficult weeks of lockdown, but stores still had to stay closed. When we moved on, as I say, to the level 3 lockdown light, as I've called it here, stores had to stay closed, but e-commerce and click and collect was permitted. Cafes and restaurants were able to operate, but to provide takeaway, food and delivery only. And what we saw really through that period was huge innovation as retailers rushed to go digital. We saw new websites being launched. We saw businesses going online for the first time. We saw people setting up systems for customers to order products and goods through text messaging. And we even saw the establishment of what I think was the country's first drive-through garden centre. As you can see in the picture here, you had people literally driving through the car park of a garden centre, selecting the plants that they wanted to be able to take home. Here in New Zealand, the lockdown happened to coincide with our autumn period. So actually the weather was really good, and there were lots of people who were wanting to get outside. So our friends here in this garden centre were able to meet that need by innovating into that drive-through arrangement. What we saw, of course, at level 3 was a huge explosion in online sales. New Zealanders had basically been kept at home for a period of some weeks without being able to go to the shop, without being able to buy new clothes, without being able to buy necessities. If you couldn't get them from a supermarket, pretty much you couldn't do them. But as we moved into level 3, we really saw the volume of sales online increase very dramatically. It was the only way for customers to be buying goods. We don't have good data on this, but we think that the total volume of sales online during alert level 3 was pretty much double what it had been just a few weeks earlier. And most interestingly, I think, for our market, they've remained high. As I say, we don't have good data on exactly what volume is being done online, but we think about 17% of all sales by volume are now being made through e-commerce channels. That's really exciting for New Zealanders because it means that there are more retailers getting on board with e-commerce. There are more customers who have been seeking to go digital and shop online. They've found that experience has been a positive one, and they've continued to do it. And that's been a bit of a systemic change in the market here. It did, of course, raise a whole lot of logistics issues because, again, the volume of product that was now being sent from New Zealand retailers out to their customers doubled overnight as well. That put huge pressure on the courier networks, on the transport networks, and it took quite a while for those issues to settle through as the freight companies worked hard to clear backlogs and adjust very much to the new normal. Interestingly enough, although the internet obviously has been around for a long time now, there were actually many New Zealand retailers that hadn't embraced it. Before COVID-19 had hit us, we think about 45% of retailers, so nearly half of all retailers here in New Zealand had no e-commerce capability. The really interesting thing is that half of those have since established it. So many businesses that hadn't previously been operating in that digital space now are. There are some for whom it doesn't really make sense. Takeaway coffee business, for example, might not want to put in place an e-commerce website to facilitate the sale of a cup of coffee. But many of those sorts of businesses are actually taking orders through SMS messaging as well. There've been a number of interesting different models that retailers here in New Zealand have used for going digital and embarking on that digital journey. We've seen a range of bespoke builds, but they're quite expensive. But we've seen retailers going online just via social media to try and win customers who might have been following them on social, but to turn that into a sales opportunity. And of course, we've seen a huge number of businesses pick up on the likes of Shopify and build their websites using those pre-existing platforms. They've been really advantageous for many Kiwi businesses because there's a relatively low cost to set those sites up, as you know, and they are pretty effective at servicing the needs of customers. There has been a real issue in New Zealand with digital capability in the retail sector. At the larger end of town, the major retailers are certainly very well attuned to the needs of the e-commerce customer. But for many of those small businesses, and if you remember that half the businesses here in New Zealand are family-owned businesses that employ no staff at all, for many of those businesses, it's quite challenging, quite daunting to be going online for the first time. And there's a lot to learn about that. And obviously we've been doing our bit to help our members with advice and information on how to do that. One of the really interesting things I think that we've seen as the e-commerce volumes have jumped up and increased substantially is that e-commerce has not only helped drive and build some revenues coming into businesses through those digital channels, but it's also actually driven foot traffic as well. Some of those firms who weren't previously online have worked out that actually having a website is a really good thing because it allows customers to view your goods, see your full range of products, understand what the pricing is, and then come in store to buy them. So that's been a real positive that's come out of it for some of those who have gone down that journey. It's fair to say, though, that e-commerce, while it's certainly been a key factor at helping the New Zealand retail sector continue to survive and thrive through this period, it isn't a substitute for bricks and mortar. There's still a real desire by Kiwi consumers to go to the physical shops to touch and feel the goods that they want, and I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. But it is really interesting to see that the level of increased e-commerce activity has certainly been sustained, I should say, post that lockdown period. I thought it would be useful perhaps just to give you a bit of an overview of what we've seen happening to total sales over the period. What I'm about to show you is the Retail NZ Sales Index. This is information about sales from Retail NZ members who bank with Westpac, and it represents the average value of sales per site at Retail NZ members. As you can see on the left-hand side of that chart there, back in March, we saw a big contraction in retail spending of, I think, about 7% at the time. That was pretty significant and reflects that economic malaise that we were talking about earlier. In April, sales plummeted by 80%. That was when we were into that harsh level 4 lockdown. And then even in May, sales were still down compared to the previous year. That's because the shops weren't able to open, and e-commerce, while it helped and certainly kept some businesses on their feet, it wasn't an effective substitute for getting customers out to the shop. Part of that too is around customer confidence. COVID-19 has been hugely disruptive all over the world, and many customers, I think, particularly in those early days, were very nervous about going out. They didn't want to be interacting with people, and they were worried that they might catch COVID, so they just stayed home. And many people thought that their jobs were on the line too, and that their incomes were threatened, so that would have been a factor in that reduced spending. If you move across that chart into August, you'll see the next red circle there. That was when we had our second level 3 lockdown in Auckland. The really interesting thing is that while there was a significant drop in spending in the week that Auckland was locked down, in the period that Auckland was locked down. It lasted for a number of weeks. Overall, in August, results were still relatively positive, I think about 8% up on the previous year. If you fast forward through to February this year in 2021, on the far side of that graph, again, you see good solid spending in February, notwithstanding the fact that Auckland was locked down for a number of days during that period. The second lockdown in February happened towards the end of the month and into March. We don't have sales numbers for that yet, but I think we will see a bit of a hit in spending, but it will still be positive relative to last year. There's been a lot of pent-up demand whenever we've been going into lockdown. Customers have needed to buy goods, and like many customers globally, people here in New Zealand want to be able to get goods and stay current as often as possible. So that's the picture of month-by-month spending that we've seen over the last 12 months. The really interesting thing is that if you start aggregating those sales numbers over a period of time, overall spending is actually up by a total of 6.7%. Since between March 2020 and March 2021, spending was up 6.7% compared to the previous year. I'm sorry, there is an error on that slide. It says since March 2019, but actually it's the period from March 2020 to March 2021. Total spending has increased a little under 7%, we think, compared to the same time the previous year. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. First, it's about the effectiveness of the government's lockdown strategy here. At the moment, New Zealand is free of community transmission of COVID-19. That means that customers can and do get out and about. They go shopping. The economy is relatively healthy. And things are going broadly well. There's been significant economic stimulus pushed into the market by the government, significant money to support wages, to support individual businesses, and a lot of cash has been flowing out of the government coffers and back to consumers and businesses. So that's really helped stimulate some of the spending that we've seen. The other thing that's really interesting about New Zealand is that our borders are closed. If you are not a New Zealand citizen, you are currently unable, pretty much, to come to New Zealand. That's a big change for us. We're a country that has long been reliant on international tourism and indeed international education as key drivers of the economy. So when the government closed the border in March last year, it was a deeply unprecedented situation. For the retail sector, though, I think it's had some advantages. It means that while we don't have international tourists coming into New Zealand to spend, it has meant that New Zealanders stuck at home are spending instead of travelling overseas themselves. On average, New Zealand is a net beneficiary of tourism. Tourists coming into New Zealand spend more than New Zealanders take away and spend overseas. But the interesting thing is that they spend in different places. International tourists come here, they spend in the hospitality sector, they hire hotel rooms, they go jet boat riding, they do skydiving and paragliding and take scenic flights up into our beautiful mountains. New Zealanders are less likely to do those things, but what we have seen over the last 12 months is that Kiwis have been getting out, they've been spending and supporting their local shops. We've seen significant jumps in spending really right across much of the sector. Homeware, hardware, books and games, toys to entertain the kids. Lots of areas of really discretionary spending have been the beneficiaries of the closed borders. However, and there is an however here, while overall spending is up, the mix of spending has really changed and there are businesses that are suffering significantly. I think about a third of retail businesses are probably not performing and not seeing the benefits that we're seeing across the nation at an aggregate level. So there are some businesses that are performing really well, and there are some businesses that are performing really badly. There are kind of three three kinds of businesses that are not doing so well at the moment. First is those in central cities. So our three big cities are Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. Workers have been slow to return to their offices in the CBDs. Workplaces have become a lot more flexible. There's a lot more working from home. That means that there's much less foot traffic about, and people are less likely to be spending during their lunch breaks. If you are a business in a tourist destination, particularly somewhere like Queenstown in the South Island, famous for its mountains and its lakes, if you're in Rotorua in the North Island, famous for its boiling mud and its geysers and its volcanic activity, or if you're down the scenic coast, the west coast of the South Island, you are really suffering hard. Those towns, even if they're offering a service which may be of interest to New Zealanders, those towns, small towns, have been very heavily reliant on international visitors for a very long time, and they're just not here at the moment, and that's very difficult for those businesses to survive. Finally, if you are a tourist-oriented business, if you are selling souvenirs to international visitors, for example, you are not in a good space, and it's very, very difficult for you to continue trading, because the reality is that New Zealanders don't typically buy souvenirs of their trips around New Zealand. And we are starting to see shops close. I took this photo here just on Saturday in a town a little bit north of Wellington at the bottom of the North Island. I don't know if you can read the sign there, but it's a New Zealand souvenir shop. It's empty, and we will see more businesses close, I think, over the coming few months. We do regular research with our members, and one of the questions that we've been asking is about how confident businesses are. Until COVID had hit, we would never have dreamed of asking this question, but we regularly survey and we ask, how confident are you that your business will survive the next 12 months? What's really interesting from this chart is that it shows that when we have a lockdown, even if it's just a limited lockdown in Auckland, our major city, we see a big and very sudden drop in retail confidence. There's really a view that we need to keep the economy going, we need to keep businesses open in order to keep turning over revenue, and in order to keep ultimately employing New Zealanders. These numbers are a little bit scary. We've got something like 37% of retailers telling us that they're either not sure if their business will survive the next 12 months. Some of them are saying it could go either way. And about half of those are not confident, or not at all confident, that their business will be there in 12 months. Those are scary and concerning numbers for our sector. There's a lot of notwithstanding the good economic performance that we've seen across much of the sector, there is a lot of hurt out there. And businesses have consumed many of their reserves over the last 12 months. It was difficult to recover from the first lockdown last year. It was harder to recover from the second lockdown in August if you were an Auckland business. And then it becomes incrementally harder the more you go on. There've now been, as I say, 4 lockdowns affecting Auckland, and each one is harder for a small business to recover from. So looking ahead, what are the key challenges for New Zealand retailers? Supply chains and logistics, I think, are increasingly the number one issue. New Zealand, as I say, is a small country. We're at the bottom of the world, and we're heavily reliant on foreign shipping lines to get goods down to New Zealand. Unfortunately, at the moment, we've seen significant congestion at our major port in Auckland. There are huge delays getting product off ship and into distribution centres, and at the same time, we're seeing significant cost increases coming through as a result of that. We're also seeing shipping lines conclude that it's too difficult to keep product coming down to New Zealand in the same way that they had before, and we're seeing capacity being cut because that capacity can be better used on on larger routes, perhaps to North America or to Europe. For retailers, there are also substantial issues around cost increases. The cost of products is going up. Cost of manufactured goods is going up, the cost of shipping is going up, and at the same time cost of employing people here in New Zealand is increasing substantially. The government is just finishing this week a project to increase the minimum wage to 20 New Zealand dollars an hour. That's up from $15.75 just 3.5 years ago. So there's been a massive jump in the cost of employing people, and there are extra costs coming down the track due to changes that the government's making in relation to things like paid sick leave entitlements and so forth. Reopening the borders is going to be challenging for New Zealand retailers. For some businesses, it will be a heaven-sent opportunity to get some of their business back. There is talk of a bubble with Australia, so that Australian visitors will be able to come to New Zealand without going into quarantine first. If that happens, that will be a huge boon to businesses serving that tourist market. However, on the flip side of that, there is a question about what it will mean for the rest of the retail sector. We've seen over the last 12 months that New Zealanders, when they're stuck here at home and not able to travel abroad, spend up domestically. It's a real question about when the borders open, whether that will continue to happen or whether we will see a significant sum of that spending moving offshore once we're able to get back into Australia or perhaps further afield. I think that it's going to be quite a long time before the borders open fully. Australia is definitely, I think, top of the government's list for getting things open, but we need to see what happens internationally. It's important to remember, I think, if you're here in New Zealand, that we are very fortunate compared to many countries overseas. COVID-19 is not present here in New Zealand. There's no community transmission of it at the moment. We've got a good secure border called the Tasman Sea and the Pacific Ocean all around us, and that makes it really quite easy to try and contain the virus and keep it out. But of course, from an economic point of view, we need to get the borders back open at some point. The broader economic environment is pretty challenging too, I think, for retailers. The other factor that we've seen is that interest rates have been very low over the last 12 months. That's encouraged a bit of a boom in the housing market. There have been some changes announced by government this week that may fundamentally alter some of the basics of the housing market and make it less reduce the price of housing, essentially, is the intention. We'll see where that goes, but as New Zealanders' house prices have increased, people have tended to feel a little bit wealthier if they've owned property. If there's pressure on those prices, it may well lead to the reverse as well, and we may see that consumers are perhaps a little bit less willing to spend. So in terms of the overall outlook for the New Zealand retail market, well, I think the key thing that's come out of COVID-19, we knew this anyway, but I think it's doubly true as a result of COVID-19, is that online is here to stay and will keep growing. We will see more and more e-commerce happening. For New Zealand businesses, they really need to jump into that digital mainstream because that's where their customers are going, and that's where their competitors are as well. New Zealand, of course, is a small country. We don't have a huge number of large retailers, but New Zealand customers do and can shop online offshore for goods. So there's a real incentive for New Zealand retailers to get in there and compete hard online. I think we potentially could see more lockdowns. Key message, I think, for everyone in the New Zealand retail sector is plan for the worst. We thought that we were through this COVID-19 situation, and then in August we were back in lockdown. We thought we were through it until February, and then we were back in lockdown. Then again we came out of it, we went back into lockdown at the end of February. So I think it's a very blunt instrument, but it is one that the government is prepared to wield to combat COVID-19, and retailers need to be planning for that. The other thing I think we'll see over the next 12 months or so is more efficiencies through store closures. Businesses will be looking to cut costs. They will be looking to recover some of the extra things that are hitting the cost side of their ledger. One of the ways they can do that is closing stores or reducing their retail footprints. I think CBDs, central business districts in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch are most at risk of that. There are significant numbers of retailers that are looking to exit some of their premises. Here in Wellington, the major department store David Jones is kind of the anchor tenant of our high street here, and it will be closing its doors next year. That's going to leave a big hole in that retail space. It's going to be very difficult to fill that. The other thing that we will see over the next little while too is a little more inflation creeping into the market. Retail, as you all know, is a really competitive business. That pressure of online trading and what's happening with your online competitors from overseas has been really effective at keeping a lid on prices. But here in New Zealand, the costs are increasing very substantially, and ultimately they are going to start being passed on to customers. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that's been interesting and useful for you to hear about the New Zealand COVID-19 experience. It's been 12 months of difficult trading for many here in the New Zealand retail market. And I'd really invite you to get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much. Terima kasih.